Thank you to all the panelists for such an insightful and interesting conversation. We now have a very special panel on one of the most pertinent questions of our times on the challenges of developing a COVID-19 vaccine. Our stellar panelists include Aadar Poonawalla, Chief Executive Officer at the Serum Institute of India, John N. Kengasong, Director, Africa Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and Soumya Swaminathan, Chief Scientist at the World Health Organization. This discussion is being moderated by Kiran Mazumdar-Shaw, who is the Executive Chairperson at Biocon. Welcome.
In 2 years or 3 years, we will be really affected, already affected by that.
Good evening, good morning, everyone. Welcome to this very pertinent panel discussion on the challenges of developing a COVID-19 vaccine. I'm Kiran Mazumdar-Shaw, who will be moderating this panel discussion. And I do apologize for the delay, but I can assure you that this panel is worth waiting for. As you know, these are extraordinary times which call for extraordinary measures. And the world, for the first time, has got together to develop vaccine for COVID-19 at what is being described as warp speed. Never before have we seen such a rapid response in the lab to market in less than 9 months. However, people need to know the risks, the benefits, and the challenges of deploying such vaccines for the world population. And moreover, there is an ethical debate on the fair and equitable distribution of these vaccines, as well as about balancing public trust with the commercial intent of vaccine makers. A great panel lined up to engage with us on these topics. So let me start with John Nkengasong, who is Director General for the Africa Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. And prior to his current position, he has played several roles at the US CDC, or the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. He serves on several international advisory boards, including CEPI, or the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Initiative, and IAVI, the International AIDS Vaccine Initiative. So, John, let me start by asking you about the global concerns around rich countries hogging the bulk of where it is said that close to 3.8 billion doses of vaccines have been pre-ordered, compared to a little over 1 billion doses via COVAX for the rest of the world. How do you think India, as one of the world's largest vaccine makers, and Africa shape global negotiations about vaccine R&D, manufacturing, allocation, and supply? Over to you, John.
No, thank you. I think, first of all, Kiran, thank you so much for including me as part of this very important conversation. And Sonia, greetings from Addis Ababa. Kate, good to meet you on this platform. I will just maybe respond to that question in 3 parts. One is actually my warm words and respect for what India has done over the years in vaccines. And that would be a segue to say that the way you develop vaccines for pandemics and outbreak is not during the pandemics and outbreak, is before that. I think that is a lesson that we as a continent of Africa must learn. And then the second thing that is that, well, be that what it is, we live in one world. We are one people. The COVID has taught us that we are more connected than we thought, that we are more vulnerable than we thought, and that we have more inequities than we thought. So the developed world must really look into this from a point of view of collective security. Health security, and then of course lastly that my own views on the morality of all of this, the vaccines that surrounding vaccines. So first of all, about India, the continent as a whole of Africa has to learn from India and China and say we are developing a continent, but we are not so poor in human and knowledge capacity to organize ourselves in a way that we should be active players in the field of research and development of vaccines. And that there are three elements that ensure human security. One is vaccines, two is the drugs, and then, of course, the diagnostics. That as a continent, if we ever need to have our own independence with respect to protecting 1.2 billion people, they have to be very deliberate engagements in these four areas, and with commitment, financial commitments from within the continent. I think that is important. And that we have some lessons to learn from India, especially the building South-South partnerships that can lead to transfer of technology, where some of the Serum Institute and others begin to see opportunities, see Africa as an opportunity to leverage and build that South-South cooperation to stand up manufacturing capacity in Africa. I think that is one. Second is really that clearly, there's a need to think about the kind of world we want to live. And when history is written, how would you want us to be remembered during this period? Do we want us to be remembered as that we live in a moment where we all look inward when the threat showed up? Or we live in a moment that we use global solidarity and cooperation to conquer a pandemic rapidly? Because it is absolutely clear in my mind that we are not going to win the war against COVID-19 without a speedy distribution of vaccines across the world. So from where I sit, I want to be on the right side of history. The right side of history is not doing the easy thing, is to doing the difficult thing. The difficult thing is to make sure that we have equitable access to vaccines across the world, to the needy, and as part of a collective security. And lastly, with respect to the morality of rich countries acquiring all the vaccines, I fully understand from a human being perspective and from a political perspective what rich countries are doing. You have your first responsibility as a political leader is to ensure the safety of your own people. I think there is absolutely nothing wrong in that. And when we are faced with a common threat, the reaction is to, first of all, look after yourself, then you look after your neighbor. I think that I fully understand. But we have to take a moral stand in this and say, how can we live harmoniously on in a world of about 8 billion people in a way that it shows a respect, and it shows that you are what you are because I am who I am, and I am what I am because you are who you are. I think that common philosophy and understanding will build a bridge to the future. And the bridge to the future absolutely will be around what I call the trust capital. Does the global south trust the global north when challenges are common? And I think it's a moral question that we have to look at, and also look at it in the lens of human rights. I think it's not easy to understand that we are dealing with a human rights issue. And let me just conclude by saying that the continent of Africa would never forget and has never forgotten that ARVs, drugs against HIV, were available in '96. And they only got to create an impact in Africa in 2006, 10 years later. And between that time, 12 million Africans died. I think history should never repeat itself. That was a moral crisis that was not necessary. Thank you.
Thanks, John. And even in the HIV crisis, if you remember, India came to the rescue of Africa with HIV/AIDS drugs. Yes. So thank you for your very poignant comments and very thoughtful comments. So let me now move on to Dr. Soumya Swaminathan, WHO's first chief scientist, who has been tasked with strengthening the organization's core scientific work and to ensure the quality and consistency of its norms and standards. She is a well-respected pediatrician from India and a globally recognized researcher on tuberculosis and HIV. And prior to WHO, Soumya Swaminathan was the Director General of the Indian Council of Medical Research in India. So Soumya, it's a pleasure to see you as always. Let me begin by asking you the question around WHO's role in regulatory harmonization of clinical endpoints. Today, we find every vaccine has different analytical and efficacy assessments. Example, some have conducted daily RT-PCR testing on all trial participants, and others have measured only symptomatic participants in arriving at efficacy. Are we comparing like for like? And more importantly, don't you think WHO has to play this sort of harmonizing role in terms of bringing vaccines to the world? Because it is responsible for vaccinating the entire planet. And in that respect, do you believe that there is something that WHO can do to build that trust that all vaccines are being looked at in a harmonized way? Or, we run the risk of vaccines from different parts of the world being looked at through different lenses?
Thank you, Kiran, and pleasure to be on this evening with my other very eminent co-panelists and with you. I think this is a very important point that you've raised. And the WHO, of course, is in the business of doing norms and standards and trying to harmonize things, especially when it's related to products which have, great public health importance. And the WHO's pre-qualification program is one of those services that a huge number of countries actually depend on. And global procurement agencies like UNICEF and Gavi depend on WHO's pre-qualification to procure vaccines. And we have Adar on the panel, and Serum is the largest vaccine supplier in the world today to these big global procurers. Now, coming back to our role, very early in this pandemic, we recognized the need that for WHO to play that role in setting some of the standards that will be needed as we are developing drugs, but also vaccines, but also drugs and diagnostics. So we started convening expert groups in January itself. And in February, we had this big research and innovation forum. We created a number of working groups at that point. They started looking at things like the animal models that would need to be used, because even for animal models, you need standardization. What's the challenge dose going to be? What kind of animal are we going to use? What kind of organs are we going to look at, and so on. Then laboratory assays, again, very critical, because as you pointed out, if everybody is going to use a different laboratory assay to measure the vaccine effectiveness, then you cannot compare. So these working groups actually started on these standardization processes and started publishing documents as they refined them. And then we also had what we do for products is target product profiles. So I think it was in end of late March or April that we put up on our website what a target product profile would be for an ideal vaccine candidate. So, single dose, stable at room temperature, highly immunogenic, good safety profile, safe in pregnancy, long lasting, if possible, lifelong immunity, easy to produce and scale. So a number of characteristics. And of course, one knows you don't get the ideal, but then you also have what would be acceptable. And then we had also very important, the criteria for a vaccine to be declared efficacious in a clinical trial. And this was, again, a group of regulators, clinical trialists, and statisticians who came together and said a vaccine needs to be at least 50% efficacious, with the lower bound of the confidence interval not being below 30%. Because if you start approving vaccines which have an efficacy of, any, let's say 30%, with a lower bound going down to 0%, then you have very little ability to know what percentage of the population are actually going to protect, even if by rolling out those vaccines. Luckily, so far, we've seen the few vaccines that have interim results that have come out have all met that benchmark of 50% efficacy with the lower bound not being below 30. So that's very good news. And that also formed the basis for our criteria for emergency use listing. And the criteria, I should say, are the same as the FDA uses. Again, it's the 50%, that lower bound of 30%. On the safety, I think we've had to shorten the period in which safety data will be collected. Normally, you would wait for, the normal clinical trials would take, 12 to 24 months. But in this case, because of the pandemic, the need for urgency, FDA and WHO both decided independently to reduce the requirement for safety follow-up for at least 2 months. After 2 months for at least half the participants in the trial to have completed 2 months of data, because we think the majority of adverse events actually occur in the first 6 to 8 weeks. But we know that, you can see serious adverse events later. And we also know that when larger numbers are vaccinated, you might start seeing some rarer events. And that's why it's very important. And currently we are working on what's going to be the requirements for pharmacovigilance and safety monitoring. And again, all of the definitions are being standardized, the protocols are being standardized. Manufacturers, of course, will commit to providing that continued follow-up data. But over and above that, countries must also put in place mechanisms for, especially for safety monitoring, but also importantly for effectiveness monitoring. Because today we think that some vaccines have a 90% efficacy, but that's based on just 2 or 3 months of follow-up. So we must continue the follow-up. And there's been a big debate, and we've contributed articles saying that blinded follow-up of clinical trial participants would be actually very important in order to get that longer-term efficacy and safety data. I think a couple of the companies have decided that they will offer to unblind those who want to be unblinded and take a vaccine that's available, particularly in the US. I think that's the decision that's been made. So we're looking at other trial designs now to see, even after some vaccines are available, how can you continue doing other vaccine trials, because we have many more vaccines in development and we must give them a chance to be tested in clinical trials, because we need a variety of vaccines to suit different populations, and also the cost is going to be very important, and the suitability for developing countries. So in all of this, WHO has, I think, played a very key role in laying down what the standards should be. And of course, we make recommendations. Ultimately, companies decide what their protocols look like. But again, I think in the majority of them, or quite a few of them, have made their protocols public. We recommend transparency there so that you can see what endpoints are being collected. And everything that we do, at least, we will be transparent and have everything available on our website.
Thanks, Soumya. Now let me move on to my dear friend Adar Poonawala to provide his perspective on this panel discussion. So Adar Poonawala, CEO of Serum Institute of India, he is the most visible face of India's vaccine industry and has received the CNN Indian of the Year 2017 award and has been appointed as the Swachh Bharat ambassador in our country. So Adar, let me ask you, as the world's largest vaccine maker, can you basically speak on why and how you decided on producing 100 million doses of vaccines at risk? I mean, this is quite a huge, daunting challenge for any company to take on. And yet you went ahead and did that. Just share with us what made you do that and, how you did it.
Sure. Nice to be here with you, Kiran, Soumya, Mr. John, and the other panelists and participants watching. Good evening. If we rewind back to when this pandemic hit us and the news global, I had two choices really, that either we just sit on the sidelines and wait for these vaccines to prove themselves in phase 3 trials, or we commit heavily in partnerships, tech transfers, and investments in rejigging of facilities, to remove the existing vaccines that we were making and defer the launches of some of the products that we had in mind for Europe and US and make COVID-19 vaccines, and also rebuild certain facilities. So that decision was perhaps the most difficult decision based on very little information at that time that we had, that which technology is going to work, which product's going to work, what kind of facility and capacity are we going to make, are people going to buy the vaccine? So we really had no information, I would say. And we had to just go on our gut feeling. And, to answer your question, it was a huge gamble, but we decided that in a matter of minutes, because the decision was that we either wait, as I said, till December to come when we would know phase 3 trials would be proving in some vaccines and then try and partner with some opportunities and manufacturers and developers, or we get in there early. Now, as a result, we will have probably, if these vaccines work, and of course, if we can deliver them, which looks quite likely, saved countless millions of lives, which would have otherwise been lost had we just sat on our laurels and didn't take any risk or bet on some of these products. Again, don't forget, it wasn't just the risk financially, but choosing the right partner and technology. And I think we were very fortunate and lucky that we were able to choose and tie up with Oxford and Novavax, which have proven to be fairly good technologies, and that too affordable ones. Again, we didn't want to go into a technology, Kiran, which we would not be able to serve African nations and India and the poorer nations, because that's where we always know there's always been a shortage. Even today there's a shortage. There's always been a shortage of vaccines for these nations because of affordability. So we again had to target that and made sure that we were able to service these nations. So this was the reasoning why we did it, and how we did it. To answer that point, as I said, rejigging facilities to be able to handle these technologies. Fortunately for us, we were developing a monoclonal antibody block, and a suite, which was rather large, which I talked to you earlier about. So we rejigged that to be able to make the AstraZeneca and Novavax products. So that's how we were able to, in a very short span of time, have the capacity to be able to ramp up like this.
So as a follow-up question, Adar, I think I just want to ask you that, as one of the world's largest or the largest manufacturer of vaccines in the world, and you very rightly said that you are helping Africa and many other countries, and the way you've looked at this humanitarian challenge and risen to it. The question I want to ask you is, why have you been excluded from supplies to ICH countries? Is there any reason? Because why would you not? I mean, is there a reason, where to sort of partition pricing of vaccines, or what is the reason? Because you are going to be developing the world's most affordable vaccines. And why wouldn't the whole world want your vaccines?
No, absolutely. But these partners also that we have worked with, like AstraZeneca and Novavax, probably didn't want to put all their eggs in one basket, and that's why they wanted to spread it around in case we failed or delayed. And but of course, the other reasons are also that the other partners and these manufacturers may not want to give their vaccines so cheap and want to make a hefty profit. So that's why perhaps they limited us to these regions. Of course, don't forget, these regions, territories that we're limited to, have a population of more than 3 billion as it is anyway, because you've got Africa with 2 billion, and you've got India with 1.3, 1.4 billion. Plus you count a little wastage if we're, of course, assuming that everyone is going to be vaccinated. So it was we are the largest manufacturing partners for these chaps, but I think over time, if they need help manufacturing and additional supply in the European and other US regions and territories, of course we can step up our production and provide vaccines there as well. We'll have to wait and see what happens.
Yeah, no, I think it's an important time for the world, because it's a collective effort, and because this is about the world coming together to develop vaccines and manufacture vaccines in a very interesting matrix way. I think it's time that India was brought into the equation in an equitable way in that sense, so that we really become part of the global consortium for vaccines for the world. And that's what I meant by saying that I don't think it's prudent to exclude certain manufacturers from the larger sort of endeavor of social good. So let me also now ask each of the panelists to really comment on one aspect, which is that, the world is now in the phase of the vaccine rollout. Several countries like UK, US, Canada, China, and hopefully India soon will start vaccinating its population. Europe is about to do so, and there are many challenges of vaccine deployment, But before that, I would like to ask each one of the panelists to comment on vaccine hesitancy and vaccine advocacy, because I think those two are going to be very important to build that trust and confidence in people about all the vaccines that have been developed at warp speed. So let me start with you, John.
No, sure. Thank you. I think that is community engagement, as I call it, and community trust is critical to the uptake of vaccines. I think on the one hand, we have to be very proud of the advances in science that led us to where we are today in under 1 year from the discovery of the virus to a vaccine or vaccines that have gone to phase 1, 2, and 3. But on the other hand is the vaccination problem. And one of the top issues to be addressed with the vaccination thing and uptake is the community trust and community engagement and leadership of that. We at the Africa CDC just announced a study yesterday where we did a survey in 15 countries in Africa, the sample size of about 15,000 to look at exactly that and address key questions of if a COVID vaccine was present today, would you take it? And then clearly you see a range that says that the good news, anyway, is that four in 5 people across the board in Africa were ready to accept, would be happy to accept the vaccine. But the range is wild. It ranges from 60% of acceptance in some countries to about 80% in other countries there. So we have some work to be done there, because that 20%, the 1 in 4 may turn out to be 2 in 4, and so we really have some work to continue to work there. But the key question there is that we have to challenge ourselves as public health leaders and say, have we done enough to engage the community? Have we done enough to also counter the social media? Because what is driving this a lot is social media. When someone has some ideas, you take your phone, you make a few pronouncements, do a video of it, then you put it out there, and then people circulate it, it goes viral. But we are not doing similarly with good messaging and to build that the accurate understanding. I always say that the currency for community trust is good information and timely information. If you don't have that timely information and good information to counter the other side of it, then poor information circulates and then people propagate that. I mean, it's very easy to share bad news than to share good news. So I think that is a piece of work that we cannot wish it away. We cannot wish that vaccine hesitancy wasn't there. They are there, so you have to deal with it. And the way you deal with it is that we approach it in a very deliberate manner, and also bring in social behavioral scientists into the space so that they can help us understand what is going on behind the scene. What is the population worried about? What are they scared about? I think unless we acknowledge that and be very deliberate in our approach and employ other people and bring them into the arena of public health response, it will continue to be a challenge.
Thanks, John. And what about you, Soumya? It will be great to hear your comment on how WHO is beginning to get into this advocacy to really improve public confidence and trust in the vaccines.
Yeah, I think John's really covered all the major issues, but maybe just 3 things I'd like to say. We've been working very closely with the social media platforms and the tech companies right from the beginning, because we recognize that along with the epidemic or the pandemic, there has been something that we named infodemic. And the Director General very early on spoke about the infodemic, which is really an overdose of information that's available to people. A lot of it is misinformation. Either knowingly or unknowingly, people are spreading things which are not correct. And so we found that there are 2 things we could do. One is to work with platforms like Google and Facebook and Twitter to make sure that people get directed to credible sources of information. When you go in and do a search, you don't go off to an anti-vax site, if you're searching for a vaccine. And the second is that we have been flagging to them cases where it's obviously false or misleading, and the companies have been actually taking those kind of posts down. So that's been one piece of work. The other one, I think, as John rightly said, it's a multidisciplinary field, actually. This whole area of public health measures being accepted by people and by communities. It's not just vaccination. There are a lot of other things we've seen, like the contact tracing apps, or even, you've seen protests in many countries in Europe against the public health measures that countries have had to put in place. So people are exercising their rights to protest, to express their views, and the only way that can be solved is through a dialogue, is by listening to people, understanding what their issues are. People have gone through a lot this year, and they also have been seeing, I think, for the first time, that you see science is being discussed on the front pages of newspapers, on every television channel. Clinical trials have never been scrutinized the way they've been doing. Every side effect, comes onto the front page of the newspapers. And for people who don't understand how clinical trials are done, this could all be very concerning, and they could start thinking that, that these are unsafe vaccines. So I think it's, again, the scientists and the public health specialists and government officers in every country really need to explain to people what the process is. How have these vaccines been developed so quickly? What are the regulatory mechanisms in place? What are the systems being put in place to monitor and to take care of anyone if they should develop a side effect? Because, these things are likely to happen once the vaccines are rolled out. And then I think we have to, as John also said, using the social and behavioral scientists to inform the strategies, the communication. And I think we can't emphasize enough how important that communication, and communication is not just giving information to people, but listening and being receptive and responding and answering the questions. And many times it's genuine questions people have. They're not anti-vaxxers necessarily. They're just people who have queries or issues or concerns which we need to address. And I still think majority of people want a vaccine. They want to protect themselves and come out of this pandemic. So that, I think, is positive.
Thanks, Soumya. And of course, Adar, you've had your share of, questions being asked on your trials. And what would you like to see in terms of what the government should do, or what the agencies should do, or what even WHO can do to build this confidence and trust and stop, as Soumya very rightly said, start sort of spreading, either misinformation or creating anxiety, which shouldn't be the way it is. What are your views on how we should handle these concerns about any adverse event which is likely to happen in any vaccine program for that matter?
No, absolutely. So I've got 2-3 thoughts which I think the government should really act upon and can act upon. Of course, using influencers to send out the right messaging and all that is there. But I think beyond that, as you've seen, and especially in mass vaccination campaigns, there are going to be reactions, some related to the vaccine, some unrelated to the vaccine. So apart from the messaging part, we need to have the government indemnify manufacturers, especially vaccine manufacturers, against all lawsuits. In fact, COVAX and other countries have already started talking about that. Because what's happening when frivolous claims come up and you see in the media something being blown out of proportion, as Soumya mentioned, it's not just anti-vaxxers, it's the general public also. Anyone may have a thought, and skepticism then sort of sets in, definitely something can happen due to the vaccine. Look at this poor chap, what's happened to him or her. So to dispel that, the government needs to step in, with messaging, with influencers, to spread also the right information, and highlighting, for example, in the US, you saw a resurgence of measles and other diseases that were sort of virtually wiped out. Because over there, the vaccine coverage started going down. People started questioning whether vaccine should be taken. There was this talk about autism and so many other things in the West. When you saw vaccination coming down, you saw the disease coming back into these sort of Western countries, in fact. including Washington, D.C. So if that can be highlighted properly, for example, then that is evidence. And when people, the general public, see that, then they realize that, yes, we have to keep vaccines going and protect manufacturers and not allow frivolous lawsuits to also happen, which then spreads further fear and wrong sort of information. So the government can act. The US, for example, has in fact invoked a law to say that during a pandemic, and this is especially important only during a pandemic, to indemnify vaccine manufacturers against lawsuits for severe adverse effects or any other frivolous claims which may come about, because that adds to the fear and also will bankrupt vaccine manufacturers or distract them if they have to just the whole day just file lawsuits and explain to the media what is happening. So I think these are a few things that the government can get involved in and do, which we are going to propose to them.
I think that's a very important point that you make, Adar, because I think this is a collective effort where the government and the industry and researchers and scientists and the medical professionals are all involved. And I really think you're absolutely right that the manufacturer of the vaccine should be indemnified, because it doesn't make sense for anyone to be targeted in that sense, because this is a warp speed under a pandemic condition and you're just trying to save lives and bring hope. So I completely agree with your point of view. Maybe we'll just quickly, before we open it up to the audience, I'd just like to ask each one of you a comment on the challenge of vaccine procurement, given the staggered and heterogeneous profiles of the vaccines. It is quite a challenge. It's how do countries or even COVAX or even a country like India, how would you go about procuring vaccines? One of the challenges that the US had was that they kind of decided upfront that they were going to procure of vaccines in certain quantums, and then suddenly they find that the first vaccine off the block was Pfizer, and they hadn't ordered enough, and now they're scrambling for more product. And now Moderna has come, and maybe they've got enough of Moderna, and maybe they'll AstraZeneca's vaccine will come, and J&J's vaccine. Now they start buying up upfront a whole bunch of vaccines that were first approved, and then they find that they've got other vaccines that are also coming along which are as good. How are you going to decide? It's a very complex challenge. So I'd like to ask John, how would you, of course, in a country like Africa and even India, right now we don't have to worry about the challenge of the mRNA vaccines because we really don't have access to them at least for some time yet. But how would you look at all the vaccines that are being developed, and how would you go about procuring these vaccines in a staggered way, whatever you might say?
So we are fortunate not to be in the situation where the United States and others find themselves with what I call a good problem, where they have a choice of buying all this other product and buying that product and all this other product. We don't even have the products to buy, so we are not in that space. Yeah, we are in the space of survival and say, how do we start immunizing our people almost at the same time as when the population in Africa will be watching TV screens and seeing immunization happening in Europe, United States, India, and other places. I think that is what haunts me and makes me go to bed every day and worry about that. And that's a very good. So I think it's not a very comfortable position to be, but it's a position that, of course, doesn't give you. You don't have to bother with choices at all. So from where we sit, we see this in phases, and we recognize that the pipeline for vaccines is very promising. The fact that the approach, most of these vaccines are targeting the spike protein, is effective, means that the subsequent vaccines that are in the trial, there's a lot of hope that those vaccines will become might be effective, and depending on how where you put the cutoff. Now, we like to characterize what we have seen so far as the first wave of vaccines. And we are hopeful that in the coming weeks or so, the next waves of vaccines will appear, and with good efficacy and good safety data. At that point, the menu will increase. The menu on which to pick these vaccines will increase. So, but there are two essential criteria that we are looking at the continent, which is like it's almost binary. Is the vaccine safe? Is the vaccine efficacious? If the answer to those two is yes, yes, then the other question that comes in is, are the conditions appropriate for the continent? That is the storage. I mean, the minus 70s, the minus 25s, and all whatnot. I think that would be secondary to what the first two criteria is there. Because we as a continent must be very open. This is not going to be an exercise that we've done before. I think this will be an extraordinary, huge, unprecedented challenge, similar to the unprecedented nature of the threat, which is of the pandemic we are dealing with. Which means that, I mean, if we had access to the Moderna or the Pfizer vaccine with storage conditions of minus 70, all what matters is that we start doing the vaccination, and you can actually conceive a scenario where you start at the capital cities with vaccination points, okay, where you put in minus 80 deep freezers at various vaccination points, and then you drive traffic towards those points for vaccination. By doing that, you start the vaccination, and then that will give you time for the next wave of the vaccines, which is, who knows, they may come up with maybe the Johnson & Johnson, which will be a single-dose vaccine, and it can be stored and transported at 2 to 8 degrees, will come in, and many others. And then your menu improves, and then you move that on a bed. What we don't want to do is to sit on our hands and say, oh, wait, until we have the most appropriate vaccine for delivery, we will then start to vaccinate. I think their populations would take that very, very unkindly.
Thanks, John. Maybe I'll open it up to question and answers, because I think we are running out of time now. So we should at least leave 10 or 15 minutes for question answers. I think one of the questions I saw in the chat box was that there was a question about how do we ensure last mile connectivity for deployment of vaccines I guess in countries like India and Africa, where really what they're talking about is that, like you said, in urban centers, it is going to be easy, but what about in the remote areas in all our countries? How are we going to go about it? And I'd like to have an answer, some responses. Maybe Soumya, you could take this first.
Yeah, so this is exactly what we've been working on over the last couple of months. And we've been doing a lot of things in parallel, which is one of the reasons why things are moving so rapidly this time. So even as Adar was saying, even before the vaccine is known to be safe and efficacious, they are manufacturing. Similarly, even before we know when the first vaccine doses are going to hit countries, we started a long time ago with what are all the preparations needed. So we developed a national vaccine deployment plan, a template for all of the things that countries would need to look at, starting from financing, because after all, it's not just the cost of the vaccine, it's the cost of the deployment. So countries are going to have to invest or take a loan or do something, find the resources. It's about training the healthcare workers, because again, each of these vaccines is going to come with different requirements. It's about identifying your vulnerable communities and groups and having a database for them. Some countries are doing digital, they're using QR codes to tag healthcare workers and also to tag vaccines. So there's a lot of innovation happening in that space. It's about your cold chain and supply chain, depending on what you have already. Do you need more help? There are countries which do not have minus 20 or minus 70 cold storage equipment, in which case we would need to supply those. So we've developed, and then regulatory indemnification. And I just wanted to say that in COVAX, we have created model indemnification language that we're asking all countries to adopt, because I think it's in this situation, it's only right that manufacturers are indemnified for a certain period of time. And for the AMC countries, we're also creating a compensation fund so that individual countries do not have to get into, legal negotiation with every individual, there'll be a global mechanism. And again, this is all to fast track vaccines going out. Regulatory harmonization, countries need to decide, are they going to go by WHO emergency use listing? Are they going to go with an SRA, emergency use authorization? If every country in the world wants to provide a license based on a dossier examination for every vaccine, that can take, forever. So all of these things, so we've got a checklist and we're working with countries. Some countries can do it on their own, some need support, and we work with our partners, UNICEF, other UN agencies on the ground, the Red Cross. There are other humanitarian UN agencies for humanitarian settings, as well as, of course, Gavi, to get all of this done. So it's a lot of background work, a lot of preparatory work, but I think many countries are actually in quite advanced stages of planning.
And, one follow-up question, Soumya, I think there was some mention that, the IATA, that is the Trade Association, and WHO were kind of working on some kind of a QR code based, like a yellow fever vaccination card, that you were actually working on some kind of a QR code based vaccination, identification that would allow for easy travel for a lot of people who have been vaccinated, as otherwise you have to basically take a test, a negative test, and then board a flight. So is there any information you can give us on that?
Sure. So what we are working on are the standards for a digital vaccination certificate, because many countries might like to use a digital rather than a paper-based certificate, and it'd be good to have that standardized. However, what we are not at all recommending at this point is that a vaccination certificate should be needed for travel or for any other purpose, even though, as you mentioned, some travel agencies in a few countries have talked about this, but that is not something that the WHO is recommending or promoting at this stage. So what we are providing is only the template for a digital vaccination certificate, which could be, globally recognized and used, but not in a way that it restricts people's movements. Yeah.
Okay, so that's good to know. And maybe Adar, you might want to talk about all the vaccines you're going to be making, right? So you're going to be making the AZ vaccine, you're going to be making Novavax. I know you've got other vaccines under development. There was one question that came from the audience saying, what is the real manufacturing differences between the various vaccines that you're going to make? And also whether other vaccines that you make which are non-COVID, is there any similarity that can help you leverage some economies of scale or ease of manufacturing?
No, of course, that's a good question. The different vaccines have different technology platforms. They use different cells to grow. They have, for example, we've got live attenuated vaccines with like Codagenics. You've got the chimp adenovirus with AstraZeneca and Oxford. You've got subunit protein vaccines with Novavax. So they're grown in different vessels, to put it simply. There's different methods of purification. They have different yields. So yes, some vaccines will be a little more expensive than others, but after you reach certain economies of scale, all that sort of thing evens out. To answer it, in a few seconds is complicated, but because of these different technologies, different yields, different long-term protection levels, we've chosen different vaccines that will, some of these vaccines may even be a one-dose vaccine, like our Codagenics vaccine might end up being a one-dose vaccine. Again, more importantly than all of this, even then, is the fact that all our vaccines we've chosen will be at that +2 to 8 degrees, and or one of them will be at -20, but nothing is going to be at -70, which is where, your last mile connectivity and all that becomes impossible with a -70 vaccine if we're talking about reaching the rural areas in any country, India, Africa, wherever it is. So keeping that in mind, we've developed and gone ahead for these vaccines.
So since we are now at the end of our panel discussion, I'd just like each one of you to really, give one message to, the audience in terms of what you want them to think about as we move into the new year in terms of the pandemic, the vaccines, and whatever else you want to think of. Soumya, why don't you start?
Yeah, thanks, Kiran. So I think just two quick messages. The first one is for people not to think that the pandemic is over just because we have a few vaccines with interim results and emergency use authorization. As the DG was saying yesterday, he said, there's light at the end of the tunnel, but the tunnel ahead of us is still quite long and dark, and we have to get through that. And the next few months may be actually quite bad in many countries around the world. So we need to keep doing the things that we know, the public health measures that keep the virus under control while we wait for enough people to have vaccines so that they develop that population immunity. That's my first message. The second message is the kind of science that we've seen this year that's come together, the way people have come together, scientists both in academia and in industry, to solve this problem, to give us a vaccine in under 12 months, to give us point of care diagnostics. Look at the speed at which things have been done. I wish we could do it for other diseases like cancer, like tuberculosis. The world has shown that when you come together to solve a problem, you can do it. And I hope that we can see this for other diseases as well, the big killers that we've not been able to address.
I completely agree with you, Soumya. In fact, this emergency use authorization model should be emulated for cancer and other debilitating diseases, because that is also a large health emergency, which needs to be met with drugs that can, have a much faster lab to market journey for patients. John, maybe you'd like to take this, make some comments as your last concluding comments.
Yes, if you can hear me, I can't see the picture anymore. But I think let me first of all agree with Sonia that with respect to the speed, the need to use this same approach to address other challenges that we have. But very importantly, my takeaway message is that a timely access to vaccines against COVID-19 is really a human rights issue. And which must be characterized by the shared values that we have as human beings of dignity, of fairness, of equality and respect, and for ourselves. I think if we fail to apply these human rights shared values, then we would have failed ourselves collectively.
Thanks, John. And Adar, the final word is yours.
No, I think Soumya and John have captured everything well. I think we have to address the human rights imbalance and inequity as much as we can. So Serum Institute and I are trying our best to do that, to get equitable vaccines out there to everybody. But I think, again, the message to your point is that we must keep taking our precautions for the next few years at least, till we are really reaching that level of herd immunity. And when I mean herd immunity, we're talking about a combination of vaccine herd immunity and a lot of the people in the population who will have got the disease by then and recovered and built a long-term, hopefully a long-term lasting effect. And that's going to be a while. So I think as much precaution as we can still take using our masks and whatever else we can do and protecting our loved ones is what we should continue doing. There is light at the end of the tunnel. It's still going to take a little while. So let's just hope that we can, reach that end point and stay safe. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John, Adar, and Soumya. This has been a very engaging conversation. And I think, the strong message is that whilst the vaccines are on the anvil, I think we can't really let our guard down. We have to ensure that we keep ourselves protected, and we basically understand that this is not an easy pandemic to handle. And, we have to basically look at it in a way that is calibrated and very responsible. So thank you so much, all three of you. A great panel discussion. Stay safe, and let's hope that 2021 will really be a promising and rewarding year ahead. Thank you.
See you. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
John.
Bye-bye. Ciao.